The Manhattan skyline stretched across the horizon like a glimmering mosaic of wealth and ambition. Dominating the view was the sleek glass tower of Kingston Enterprises, a corporate empire built by Alexander Kingston, a billionaire whose name was synonymous with power. Alexander, 33, sharp-suited and colder than the steel girders of his skyscraper, strode into the boardroom, where his executives awaited their quarterly reckoning. "Make it quick," he said, his piercing blue eyes scanning the room. "I have a plane to catch." Alexander's life was a relentless pursuit of success, measured not in moments but in milestones. He had conquered industries, crushed competitors, and now sought the ultimate goal, cementing Kingston Enterprises as a global monopoly. Yet something gnawed at him, a whisper of emptiness, buried under layers of achievement. Later that evening, Alexander's limousine threaded through the chaotic streets of Brooklyn, far from his usual orbit. The vehicle slowed at a traffic light, and his eyes drifted out the tinted window. That's when he saw her. A young woman stood on the corner, balancing a cardboard tray of water bottles and homemade lemonades. Her hair, dark and wavy, cascaded over her shoulders. She was not dressed in the elegance Alexander's world demanded, just a faded sundress and worn sneakers. Yet her eyes sparkled with determination, and her smile, aimed at a passing pedestrian, was radiant enough to rival the neon glow of the city. "Stop the car," Alexander commanded. His driver hesitated. "Sir, this is—" "Now." The limousine halted. Alexander stepped out, a figure of polished wealth amidst the grit of the street. The girl noticed him and tilted her head, her curiosity evident. "Water or lemonade?" she asked, her voice soft but confident. "Neither," he replied. His tone clipped. "Who are you?" She blinked, taken aback. "Emma Carter," she said cautiously, "and you're standing in my way of making rent this month." The bluntness amused him. "Emma," he repeated, tasting the name. "What are you doing selling drinks on a corner at this hour?" Emma folded her arms, her expression hardening. "What's it to you? You need water or not?" Alexander's phone buzzed, a reminder of his next meeting. He ignored it. Instead, he reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill and handed it to her. "That's for a lemonade. Keep the change," he said. Emma hesitated before taking the money. "You know, you could have just said thank you," she muttered, handing him the drink. Alexander walked back to his car, sipping the lemonade. It was too sweet. Yet, as he settled into his seat, the sharp edges of his day seemed to dull. For the first time in years, he felt curious about someone other than himself. The next morning, Alexander's mind was a battlefield. His empire demanded his attention, but his thoughts kept circling back to Emma. Who was she? What kind of life did she lead? Why did she seem so unshaken by a man whose presence could crumble boardrooms? By noon, he was doing something entirely out of character. He cancelled a meeting. Then, without telling his assistant, he had his driver take him back to the Brooklyn corner. Emma was there, her tray lighter now. When she saw him, she rolled her eyes. "You again? Are you stalking me?" Alexander smirked. "Hardly. I wanted to know if you're always this rude to paying customers." Emma sighed, wiping her brow. "Look, Mr. Fancy Suit, I don't have time for this. I need to sell these drinks, or my grandma doesn't get her meds this month. You buying or not?" Her words struck him like a blow. He'd grown up with wealth, insulated from struggles like hers. The idea of working yourself to exhaustion just to keep someone alive was foreign and unsettling. "I'm buying," he said, pulling out his wallet again. This time Emma shook her head. "No charity. If you want to help, buy a drink for someone who can't afford one. That's how I do business." Her resolve intrigued him. He pulled out a wad of cash and handed it to a passing stranger. "Drinks for everyone," he declared. Emma sighed but handed out the bottles. As the crowd thinned, she turned to Alexander. "Why are you doing this?" He shrugged. "I want to know more about you." Emma's laughter was unexpected. "Rich guys don't hang around girls like me. What's your angle?" Alexander hesitated. He wasn't sure himself. All he knew was that her spark had ignited something in him, a longing for connection in a world that worshipped profit. As the days passed, Alexander found excuses to visit Emma's corner. Their interactions grew warmer, punctuated by her wit and his veiled vulnerability. He learned about her grandmother, June, whose failing health weighed heavily on Emma. She, in turn, teased him about his suits and his inability to drink lemonade without wincing. But Emma's world was fragile. Each night, she returned to a cramped apartment where medical bills piled higher than hopes. And though Alexander's presence seemed like an escape, she knew better than to dream of fairy tales. One evening, after an unusually long conversation, Emma said, "You can't keep coming here. We're from different planets." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I decide where I go, Emma. Maybe, but I decide who gets close. And I don't let billionaires into my orbit. Too much risk of collision." Her words haunted him. He'd spent his life taking what he wanted, but with Emma he felt the weight of her barriers and the first stirrings of something real. One stormy night, as Emma packed up her tray, a shadow loomed over her. A man, rough-looking and reeking of trouble, grabbed her arm. "You owe me, Carter," he snarled, "and I'm done waiting." Emma's cry echoed through the empty street, just as Alexander's limousine turned the corner. Rain hammered against the windows of Alexander Kingston's office, the relentless storm matching the turmoil in his mind. The image of Emma Carter haunted him, her resilience, her fire, the way she had dismissed him with no regard for his status. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he needed to see her again. But Alexander wasn't a man used to rejection. He had built his empire through unrelenting control, and Emma's boundaries had ignited a stubbornness in him. She had drawn a line between their worlds, and he was determined to cross it. Emma, meanwhile, wrestled with a storm of her own. Back in her tiny apartment, she placed a damp towel on her grandmother's forehead. June's breaths were labored, her frail body trembling under layers of blankets. The rattling cough that broke the silence was a constant reminder of Emma's precarious reality. "Don't worry, Nana," Emma whispered, forcing a smile. "I'm working on it." June's eyes opened, clouded yet warm. "You're doing too much, love. You need to think about yourself for once." Emma shook her head. "You're all I have." They fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the patter of rain against the window. Emma stared at the stack of medical bills on the counter. She needed money, more than selling lemonade could ever provide. And the man who had approached her earlier that week had made it clear he wouldn't wait much longer. She closed her eyes and exhaled. She couldn't think about him now. Instead, her thoughts drifted to Alexander, the billionaire who kept showing up like an unlikely knight in a three-piece suit. She had told him to stay away, but part of her wondered what might happen if she let him in. Could someone from his world truly care about someone from hers? The following day, Alexander arrived at the Brooklyn corner only to find it empty. The tray of drinks, the bright smile, gone. His chest tightened with an unfamiliar worry. "Where is she?" he muttered, more to himself than to his driver. He spent the next hour scouring the nearby streets, feeling increasingly out of place amidst the crumbling buildings and crowded sidewalks. Just as he was about to give up, he spotted her in a small alley, her head bowed as she argued with a man whose presence radiated menace. Alexander's instincts kicked in. He stepped out of the car, his polished shoes splashing into a puddle. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew enough about power plays to recognize one in progress. "Emma!" he called, his voice slicing through the tension. Both heads snapped toward him. Emma's eyes widened, a mix of relief and panic flashing across her face. The man, wiry and mean-looking, scowled. "And who the hell are you?" the man demanded, stepping closer to Alexander. "I'm someone you don't want to cross," Alexander said, his tone icy. He glanced at Emma. "Is everything all right here?" Emma hesitated, her gaze darting between the two men. "It's fine, Alexander. Just leave." The man chuckled darkly. "Alexander, huh? You some kind of boyfriend?" Alexander's jaw clenched. "That's none of your concern. What is my concern is whether Emma is being bothered." The man looked ready to respond, but Emma cut in. "It's fine," she said, more firmly this time. "Let's go, Alexander." Alexander didn't move at first, his instincts screaming to stay. But the look in Emma's eyes, a desperate plea for him to back off, finally swayed him. He nodded curtly and followed her out of the alley. When they reached a quieter street, Emma turned to him, her expression stormy. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he countered. "Who was that?" "No one you need to worry about," she said quickly. Too quickly. Alexander's frustration bubbled to the surface. "Emma, I'm trying to help you, but you keep shutting me out." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You don't understand, Alexander. You can't just swoop in and fix things with your money." "Maybe I can," he said, stepping closer. "But you have to let me try." Her eyes softened for a moment, but then she shook her head. Not everything is for sale, Alexander, not trust, not my life. That night, back in her apartment, Emma sat by her grandmother's bedside, her thoughts a jumble. She wanted to believe in Alexander's sincerity, but she had learned the hard way that rich men only cared about their own agendas. And yet, when she had seen him in the alley, her heart had leapt. He had looked so out of place, yet so determined. For a fleeting moment she had felt protected. It was a dangerous feeling to entertain. Her grandmother stirred. "That young man you mentioned," June rasped. "He seems different." Emma smiled faintly. "He's different, all right. Too different." "Maybe different is what you need," June said before drifting back to sleep. Emma sat in the quiet, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Could Alexander Kingston, with all his wealth and privilege, really care about someone like her? Or was she just a passing interest, a novelty in his carefully curated life? Alexander wasn't faring much better. Back in his penthouse, he stared out at the stormy skyline, his mind on Emma. She had drawn him in with her independence, her refusal to be impressed by his status. But beneath her strength, he sensed a vulnerability that called to something deep within him. For the first time in his life, Alexander wanted to give, not take. He wanted to be someone Emma could rely on, not just a man who could solve her problems with a check, but he also knew that earning her trust would be the greatest challenge he'd ever faced. The next morning, Alexander made a decision. If Emma wouldn't let him help directly, he would find another way. He called his assistant and set a plan in motion, one that would bring him closer to her world without her knowing. But as he stepped out onto the bustling streets of Manhattan, a lingering question gnawed at him. Was he doing this for her, or for himself? Days passed and Alexander's plan began to take shape. If Emma wouldn't accept his direct help, he would work in the shadows. He started by sending a discreet team to investigate her situation. Nothing invasive, just enough to understand the pressures she faced. What he uncovered only deepened his resolve. Emma's grandmother, June Carter, was battling a chronic lung condition. The bills from her treatments were astronomical, far beyond anything Emma could manage selling lemonade and water bottles. The landlord of their crumbling apartment building had also issued a notice of eviction, giving them just 2 months to find somewhere else to live. Alexander stared at the report in his office, his chest tightening. He had grown accustomed to solving problems with a phone call or a stroke of a pen, but Emma's pride presented a unique obstacle. She wouldn't accept charity, and forcing his way into her life might destroy whatever fragile connection they had begun to build. Meanwhile, Emma's world was becoming increasingly precarious. The man from the alley, Vince, had started appearing more frequently, his threats escalating. He was a small-time loan shark, but his reputation for violence loomed large in their neighborhood. Emma had borrowed money from him months ago, desperate to cover a round of hospital bills, but she hadn't anticipated the impossible interest rates. Now he was demanding repayment she couldn't provide. One afternoon, as Emma pushed her cart of drinks through the crowded streets, Vince cornered her near an abandoned storefront. "You're running out of time, Carter," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "I don't care how you get the money, but if I don't see it by next week, your little lemonade stand won't be enough to save you." Emma squared her shoulders, refusing to show fear. "I'm doing the best I can, Vince. Just give me a little more time," Vince sneered. "Time doesn't pay debts. Maybe that rich boyfriend of yours can help." Emma's heart sank. Vince must have seen her with Alexander. "He's not my boyfriend," she snapped, "and he has nothing to do with this." "Too bad," Vince said, his smile dark. "Rich guys like that? They can afford to make problems disappear. Think about it, Carter." That evening, Emma returned home exhausted, her mind racing. She couldn't let Vince's threats consume her, but the weight of her grandmother's condition and their financial struggles felt suffocating. She looked over at June, who was sitting up in bed, knitting something with her trembling hands. "Nana, you should be resting," Emma said gently. June smiled. "Resting is for the dead, love. Besides, this helps me keep my mind off things." Emma sat beside her, holding her grandmother's hand. "We'll get through this," she whispered, more to convince herself than anyone else. June nodded. "You always find a way, Emma. You're stronger than you think." Alexander, too, was grappling with his own thoughts. He had tried to focus on his work, but Emma's situation consumed him. That evening, he found himself standing outside her apartment building, his driver waiting in the car. He hesitated before stepping out, unsure if his presence would be welcome or even appropriate. As he approached the door, Emma appeared, carrying a bag of groceries. She froze when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a mix of surprise and suspicion. Alexander cleared his throat. "I wanted to check on you." Emma frowned. "You shouldn't be here. This isn't your world." "I don't care about worlds, Emma," he said, his tone firm. "I care about you." Her eyes softened, but she shook her head. "You don't understand what you're getting into." "Then help me understand," he said, stepping closer. "Let me in." Emma hesitated, her walls wavering. Finally she sighed. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." She led him up to her. The dimly lit stairwell a stark contrast to the polished hallways of his penthouse. Inside, the space was small but tidy, the air filled with the faint scent of lavender. June looked up from her knitting and smiled. "And who's this handsome young man?" she asked, her voice warm but frail. "Just a friend, Nana," Emma said quickly. Alexander stepped forward, offering his hand. "Alexander Kingston, ma'am." "It's a pleasure to meet you," June chuckled. "Ma'am, he says, I like this one." Emma rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. For the next hour, Alexander sat with them, listening to June's stories and watching as Emma cared for her with gentle precision. It was a side of her he hadn't seen before, and it only deepened his admiration. As Alexander left that evening, he made a silent vow. He couldn't sit by and watch Emma struggle. If she wouldn't accept his help openly, he would find another way. The next morning he began making calls. First, he arranged for June to see a top pulmonologist, the visit scheduled discreetly under an anonymous benefactor. Then he contacted a real estate agent and secured a small but comfortable apartment nearby, leaving it ready for Emma to move in should the need arise. But Alexander's growing involvement wasn't without its risks. Vince, the loan shark, had noticed his presence and saw an opportunity. A week later, as Emma was closing her stand for the evening, Vince appeared again, this time flanked by two burly men. Before she could react, they surrounded her. "You've been busy, Carter," Vince said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Making friends with billionaires now, are we?" Emma's pulse quickened. "What do you want, Vince?" "What I'm owed," he said simply. "And since you seem to have some powerful connections, I suggest you use them." Emma's defiance faltered. "Alexander has nothing to do with this." "Doesn't matter," Vince said, leaning in close. "Because if I don't get my money soon, everyone you care about is going to pay." Later that night, Emma sat on the floor of her apartment, her knees drawn to her chest. The weight of Vince's threats pressed down on her, suffocating any hope she had left. She had tried to shield Alexander from her world, but now it seemed her problems were dragging him in. At that moment her phone buzzed. It was a text from Alexander. "I'm here if you need me. Always." Emma stared at the screen, her heart aching. She wanted to believe him, but could she risk letting him get involved? Could she bear to see him hurt because of her? Alexander, sitting in his penthouse, felt a knot in his chest. He could sense Emma pulling away, and he didn't know how to stop it. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't give up on her, not now, not ever. The city buzzed with the electric hum of anticipation. Alexander Kingston sat in his penthouse, staring out at the sprawling metropolis below, his mind a storm of worry. Emma had grown increasingly distant over the past week, her brief replies to his texts raising alarms he couldn't ignore. Something was wrong, and he could no longer stand idly by. "Mr. Kingston," his assistant's voice interrupted over the intercom. "You have an urgent meeting in 30 minutes. "Cancel it," Alexander said curtly, standing and grabbing his coat. "But, sir—" "I said cancel it." His tone left no room for argument. Alexander headed for the door, determination etched into every step. He had a sinking feeling that Emma needed him more than she was willing to admit, and he wasn't going to let her push him away any longer. Meanwhile, Emma sat in the corner of the small cafe she often used as a refuge, her hands trembling as she nursed a cup of tea. Vince's threats had escalated. The deadline he'd given her was looming, and she still had no way to repay the debt. The thought of him harming her grandmother, or worse Alexander, kept her awake at night. She had tried to handle everything on her own, but the walls were closing in. The constant pressure was wearing her down, and for the first time in years she felt truly hopeless. Her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Alexander. "I'm on my way. Don't shut me out, Emma." Her chest tightened. She wanted to tell him to stay away, to let her deal with her problems alone, but deep down, she knew she couldn't face this on her own anymore. Before she could respond, a shadow fell across the table. She looked up to see Vince standing there, his expression cold and predatory. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, sliding into the seat across from her without waiting for a reply. Emma stiffened. "What do you want, Vince?" He leaned back, smirking. "You know exactly what I want, and I'm done playing nice." "I don't have the money yet," she said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. Vince's smirk faded. "Then you'd better figure out how to get it. Because if you don't—" He let the threat hang in the air, his meaning unmistakable. Emma's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "We're watching. Don't involve him." Her blood ran cold. Vince must have someone following her, and by extension Alexander. She couldn't let him get hurt because of her mistakes. "I'll figure it out," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the table. "Just give me a little more time." Vince stood, looming over her. "I've got until tomorrow night. After that I make the rules." That evening, Emma returned home to find Alexander waiting outside her building. He leaned against his sleek black car, his presence both reassuring and nerve-wracking. "Alexander, you shouldn't be here," she said as she approached him. "You keep saying that," he replied, stepping closer. "But I'm not leaving until you tell me what's going on." Emma hesitated, her instinct to protect him warring with her desperate need for support. Finally, she sighed and gestured toward the building. "Come inside, we need to talk." Once inside, Alexander took in the cramped apartment, his gaze lingering on the stack of bills on the counter and the threadbare furniture. Emma avoided his eyes, focusing instead on making tea. "Emma," he said gently, "I know about Vince." Her hands froze mid-motion. "What?" "I've been looking into your situation," he admitted. "I know about the debt, the threats. Why didn't you tell me?" Emma spun to face him, anger flaring in her eyes. "Because it's not your problem, Alexander. This is my mess to clean up." "You don't have to do it alone," he said, stepping closer. "Let me help you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "And what happens when Vince decides you're a threat, or when he comes after Nana? I can't risk that." Alexander placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice firm. "I'm not afraid of him, Emma, and I won't stand by while he hurts you." For a moment, Emma let herself lean into his strength, but the weight of her fears was too great. She pulled away, shaking her head. "You don't understand how dangerous he is." "Then make me understand," Alexander said. "Tell me everything." Emma finally relented, recounting the series of events that had led her to borrow money from Vince and the impossible situation she now found herself in. Alexander listened intently, his jaw tightening with every detail. When she finished, he took a deep breath. "We're going to fix this," he said, his tone resolute. Emma laughed bitterly. "And how do you plan to do that? Write him a check?" "No," Alexander said, his eyes glinting with determination. "People like Vince don't back down because of money. They back down because of power." "What are you talking about?" Emma asked, frowning. Alexander smirked faintly. "You're not the only one who knows how to fight dirty." The next day, Vince received an unexpected visitor at the dingy bar he used as his headquarters. A man in a tailored suit walked in, flanked by two imposing bodyguards. "Mr. Kingston," Vince said, his bravado faltering as Alexander approached. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Alexander smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I believe you've been causing some trouble for a friend of mine." Vince's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Emma Carter," Alexander said, his voice icy. "You've made her life hell, and that stops now." Vince sneered. "And what are you going to do about it, billionaire? Call the cops?" Alexander stepped closer, his presence intimidating, despite the lack of physical force. "I don't need the cops. What I have is influence, connections, the kind that can make your life very uncomfortable." Vince scoffed, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You think you can scare me?" "I don't need to scare you," Alexander said smoothly. "I just need to remind you who you're dealing with. Walk away, Vince. Drop the debt and you'll never hear from me again." Vince hesitated, the weight of Alexander's words sinking in. Finally, he growled, "Fine, but if she misses another payment—" "There won't be another payment," Alexander interrupted. "You're done here." That evening, Alexander returned to Emma's apartment, his expression unreadable. "What did you do?" Emma asked, sensing the shift in him. "I handled it," he said simply. "Alexander, I told you not to—" "I couldn't stand by and watch him hurt you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You mean too much to me, Emma." Her breath caught in her throat. "You mean that?" He stepped closer, cupping her face in his hands. "I've never been more sure of anything." For the first time in weeks, Emma let herself hope. Vince was no longer a threat, and for the first time in years, she felt safe. But as she looked into Alexander's eyes, she realized something else. She wasn't just safe, she was loved, and she loved him back.